Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a premier field engineer dedicated to supporting system center technologies. Today's discussion will be part 2 in our series, pulling back the covers on application deployment in Configuration Manager 2012. Today's discussion will be centered on packages, some conditions and terms of use, as well as copyright and trademark information, and then our agenda. So we'll talk about packages for a minute. Talk about the idea of applications or packages, spend a lot of time in demo building packages. In fact, as we get started with our discussion, let's just go right ahead into our lab environment, because that's where we'll spend the rest of our time. So, as we talked about, this is a series leading its way through the concept of application deployment in Configuration Manager. It is a big topic. It is a function of Configuration Manager that virtually every company who uses the product is taking advantage of, and is key to the use of the product, and so on. Packages is the style of distribution of content that existed in previous versions of Configuration Manager. So Configuration Manager 2007, SMS 2003, SMS 2.0, many cases really unchanged through those versions. Yeah, a few tweaks here and there, but basically the principles are the same. Application deployment is a significant shift from the way that we deal with packages in Configuration Manager. So the question comes up, which should I use? Application deployment, which we'll talk about next time, or packages? And the answer is, the preference really is for application deployment, just because of the cool things that it brings to the table. But there are some places where using packages makes a lot of sense still. And at least understanding the options available with packages at least puts that tool in your tool belt, so that you can evaluate using that in given scenarios where it makes sense. So that's where we'll spend time today, is talking about packages, how we build them, and what the different options are. So again, to set the context for today, we'll talk about it from an administrative perspective, show how to build the server-side components for a couple of packages, really mainly focusing on one. And then in later sessions, we'll move to the client side, see how the packages actually respond whenever we make use of them on the client side, and go from there. So packages are found under the application management node, and that's where we'll spend most of our time today. So there's a few different ways that we can actually build a package. The first, and the one that we'll spend the most time in, is the Create Package Wizard. And then here's the Create Package from Definition Wizard. So there are file types that actually will feed definitions about the package structure, different options for creating a package into Configuration Manager. Before I go further, a couple of terms. What we're talking about with building a package is the idea of trying to get content around the network through the Configuration Manager hierarchy and delivered to, ultimately, Configuration Manager device clients, or user clients for that matter too, and to be able to install that software or make it available to the user population, or the device population. To do that, we have to create, in this context, a package. A package consists of typically a program as well as a deployment. For those familiar with Configuration Manager 2007 and previous, you'll know deployments as advertisements. A package doesn't have to have all of those components. It typically does. We'll highlight reasons why you might not have all of those components as we roll along. But that's the context. So the package itself is a combination of all of those things. Really, though, the package component by itself defines where the content is on the network that we're trying to access to deploy out to the various machines and users in our environment. Okay, so enough said about the terminology. Now let's go actually create these various components. So there's two options here for, three really, but two options for creating packages. There's the third one for importing packages that you've already got created, which is an interesting piece to discuss just briefly. So in Configuration Manager, you have the ability throughout the console to do exporting and importing of information. You see the import option up here. You see the export option here. There's various plays at which you might want to export and import, such as migration from one hierarchy to another, one site to another, that kind of thing. Maybe sharing it between different organizations if that's appropriate. One also decent play would be, it could be that you have created packages in this context that you have completed, and they're really due to be expired in your environment and removed, but you just don't want to completely get rid of them. You really want to save the definition of this package so that in the future, if you need to come back to it, it's just a matter of importing it. That's definitely a use too. So that's what the export and import functionality is all about. Certainly we have the ability to create folders for structuring how we represent and organize our packages and so on. So those two things are there. The main two things we'll talk about here are creating a package and then creating a package from definition. So there are various definition files that have been used historically in Configuration Manager. The one that most folks will use today, if you're going to use this option, is to simply point at an MSI and allow Configuration Manager to read information out of the MSI and create appropriate package programs for you. Okay, so that's what we'll do real quick, and we'll just hit it really quickly and spend most of our time in the Create Package Wizard. That's my preference. Everyone has their own, so we'll just do this quickly. So the first thing I want to do in this wizard is specify who my publisher is. So Microsoft, Microsoft Corp, whatever. Really, that's going to come whenever I actually browse for the file type. So I'm going to go out and find just a miscellaneous MSI. I'm actually going to pull it out of my package source folder. More on the package source folder in a minute. I'm just going to hit WMGAPI. It's an MSI, no big deal, and pull it in. So we'll read in the definition. Its publisher is Microsoft. Here's the name of the file, okay, version and so on. So I'll click Next in the wizard. Now I'm going to specify always obtain source from the source directory, create a compressed copy of the source, package does not contain any source files, whatever. Whichever one is most appropriate. Most often, and again I'll talk about this later, we're going to choose always obtain source files from a source folder, but just to move on through this, I'm going to go ahead and say package doesn't contain any, and hit Next. Main thing I want to show you here is just by doing this, I was able to generate 6 programs. Okay. Normally, whenever I'm done, I would have to go through and create any additional programs that I want. But by going through the Create Definition wizard and selecting the right package, I have 6 programs that were created for me by the wizard. This is pretty useful as shortcuts. A question that comes up from time to time is, do we have natively in Configuration Manager, previous versions, 2007, the ability to automatically uninstall a package or an application if the need arises? And the answer is no, we don't. But we do have the ability to create automatically the kind of programs that would be needed for an uninstall, and then we can just simply execute those versions of the programs against whichever devices or user population that need to have the program removed. So that is there and really uniquely created for you in an automated way whenever you import from definition. So this is using the MSI. Depending on the way that you do this, not everything may always generate this way, but this is a good generic example. So I'm going to put a bookmark there. That's really all I want to talk about on that wizard, and I want to go to the other wizard, which gives us a few more options and spend time going through that. So let's go create our package. So this wizard pops up and starts to ask us a little bit more information and gives us more flexibility, which is why I like it. The other one assumes that you have a definition. This one assumes that you don't, and you're going to have to define it yourself. So I'm going to go ahead and just create sample app 1, or I'll just call it package to avoid confusion. Okay, and so here you can go ahead and place information as far as description, manufacturer, any language and version information you care about, and then you get asked the question about, does this package contain source files? So this is one place where package deployment is unique from application deployment in that with a package, you don't have to specify source files. With an application, we expect that there will be source files that we're going to be leveraging through the deployment. So if you want to do something like just simply run an executable that maybe exists on all of your systems already, or maybe run a batch file that exists, or whatever, maybe an existing file that's part of the OS on your systems, then very likely packages is the answer for you to do that, because we don't require source files. We can just allow you to specify a command line, and you'll see where you can do that in a bit. Now, having said that, the vast majority of packages will have source files because the goal of packages in most cases is to install content on the target machine, okay, for the target user. All right, so we'll go ahead and say the package does contain source files, and then we'll click Browse. Before I do that, though, I want to talk to you about the concept of source files. So source files probably make sense just by the name. The source files will be the files that you want to distribute to the environment and install on the machine. So here I just have created a folder called package source. And in here I have the client folder. So for this demo, I'm just using the config manager client files, no big deal. So in here, in this client folder, I have specifically the files necessary that I'll deploy. This is the executable that will install the client, okay, and then supported files underneath. So when I go to actually specify my source directory, I'm going to drill down all the way to my client folder, because that is the most specific level of the structure, my package source directory, that I can go to that will only target or pull in or describe the files associated with my client, okay, in this case. So it's possible, though, that you could actually go through. There's nothing to say that you couldn't go through and specify the entire package source folder. The problem with that is, in most environments, many environments, your package source folder will contain your client files, or package the files for package A, package B, package C, all the way down the line. Maybe hundreds of packages that you're going to deploy. If you specify the top level folder, even though you may later specify an MSI or an executable within that folder as the actual file to run, you're going to actually end up encapsulating the entire package source folders every single time you build a package, which will very quickly cause you to eat up disk space on your distribution points, especially if you use the legacy style distribution point. More on that in just a minute, okay, or near the end of our discussion. So just make sure that when you point to your source directory, you get as specific as you can, but not too specific. So what do I mean by not too specific? Well, if my executable or my file that I need to initiate is actually embedded within a folder here, like this, as an example, say I want to run client here, I don't want to just specify the i386 folder, because that wouldn't include the rest of these folders and files. I do need to get client, so you need to stop at the highest level that gets all the content that you need. Hope that makes sense. Okay. All right, so we'll go ahead and close that down. Let's go ahead and specify our source. Now, one of the options that you have here is either to specify a network path or specify a local drive on the site server. This, again, is a unique option for packages. For everything else, you're going to be asked to specify a UNC, and we recommend that you specify a UNC here. The reason being, you can easily go ahead and specify a local drive on the site server. Makes it very easy to browse to and point to your source directory. The challenge with that is, though, during migration, as you swap out servers at some point, maybe reinstall your primary site or whatever on a different box, retire one, whatever, as you have churn in your environment, then if something happens where you're retiring config manager off of a server and you've specified a specific source directory and that source directory changes, then you're kind of in a difficult situation if you're migrating. So I think in terms of folks that are migrating from Configuration Manager 2007 to 2012, you're not going to have the same site server. it's going to be different. 2007 and 2012, two different site servers. So if your source directory exists on the 2007 server, and you have configured your packages to point to that local drive, then when you migrate that content over to 2012, that content's no longer on the local drive. So your mapping no longer makes sense. However, if you would have used a UNC, then that UNC would be valid in the 2012 environment, just like it would be in the 2007 environment. So it really is the best approach to use a UNC, and that's what we'll use here. So I'm going to specify my source directory. Okay, and then inside there, it helps if I type it right, doesn't it? I think I did. Let's see. Nope. Let me add that in. There we go. So inside that, I'm going to hit client. Okay, so now I have my source directory. Notice I haven't told it yet what to do with it, what command line to run. So now I have to tell it what kind of program do I want. Either I can create a standard program, that's what you'll do most of the time, or if I'm deploying this program to a device, I can choose this, and we'll have options that are unique for device. A little bit on that. A device is a generic term in Configuration Manager 2012 to describe a computer, mobile device, that kind of thing. So to avoid confusion here, this program, this package area, programs, and so on, is really taking some legacy terminology and putting it into Configuration Manager 2012. So in this context, device really isn't talking about a generic computer or mobile device combined. Program for device here is specifically referring to a mobile device. Okay, and in order to install programs, install packages on a mobile device, it needs to be a device type that is managed by depth management. So far beyond our discussion today to talk about what depth management is all about. Suffice it to say, depth management includes those mobile devices that are in that support category today. Those include Windows CE style devices, mobile 6.1, 6.5, Nokia Symbian, and that's it. Your Androids, your iPhones, your Windows phones don't fall into that category. So this middle option is not useful for deploying programs to those types of devices. Okay, so the third option, do not create a program, is perhaps an oddball looking thing for a minute, except to say, let me just put this context around it. There are some cases where you'll want to create a given program, a given package, and actually not have it serve any purpose other than a pointer to where the content is. An example of that is an operating system deployment. Through operating system deployment, it is necessary it's required to have a package or a location where the task sequences can find the Configuration Manager client files. The mechanism to do that is through the content distribution mechanism in Configuration Manager. We basically create a package and point it to the client files, and then that's really all we need. We just need a pointer. We're not going to create a program. We don't have to for the task sequence. We don't need a deployment. We don't have to for the task sequence. All we need is a pointer so that during the task sequence execution, we know where to go to get our client files. Okay, that's really it. So those two explained. Now let's spend some time talking about our standard program. Next option we have is to line out the information around being our standard program. So what's the name? So I'm just going to call this sample program 1, keep the naming convention in order. Now I have the command line. So here's where I specify the specific command line that I want to install. And you don't necessarily have to do anything but just type in the command and the associated switches. To get context as to what you need to do in this area, you can click Browse, and this should take you directly into your source folder location. So it did, and in my case, it's the client folder. Okay. So in my case, I'm just going to run Ccm Setup. So I can select that and hit Open, and then I can put on any command line switches that I like after that. Now, it could be, thinking about our examples, that your setup file is not here in the root of your source location. It could be in one of your child folders. So you could browse to that child folder, and maybe here I would just pick one like this, and we'll adjust the path to include what we need. Okay. So let me go back and fix this. I also have the ability to specify a startup folder that I want to use. Typically, you don't need to do that, but it's there. Okay. Other options that I have here. I have the ability to run normal, minimize, maximized, hidden. The vast majority of cases, you're going to run normal. And let's explain that for a minute. When you deploy content, in fact, the next couple of boxes we're going to talk about, when you deploy content, one of the decisions you need to make is whether to deploy that content using administrative credentials or using the credentials of the logged on user. Okay. The most often used choice is to use administrative credentials, and certainly that will be the vast majority of what you do in your environment, I'm sure. Administrative credentials means to Configuration Manager that when we attempt to install the given package, the given program, we're going to do so using the credentials of the local system account. Okay, so when you use the local system account, essentially that creates a separate work environment, logged on user environment, if you will, on the client. So very much as if you had two users logged on to a system, the two users don't see each other's sessions by default, right? When you deploy something under the context of the administrative credentials or local system, even if you have a user logged on to that system, they're not going to see it. It's completely obscured because it's not in their context. Therefore, since the vast majority of deployments are done using the administrative context, using the option of normal here is typically fine, and that's what you're going to find in most cases. The other options make sense and are helpful whenever you're deploying content to a user context. Okay, so in that user context, you might want to specify that if the application, well, first of all, in the user context, the vast majority of the time I would think you would want to drive that deployment and have it hidden from the user. Okay, you can certainly do that in many cases with just a command line switch on the program package that you're deploying. But sometimes you might want to run it maximized, might want to run it minimized, and in some cases you might not have the ability to run hidden from the command line. So we give you the hidden option that you can specify if that's what you want to do. Okay, so all of these options together just give you the flexibility that you might need to cover various scenarios, but the majority of the time, likely you will use normal here. So that's what I'll choose. Okay. Now, the next option, really, to talk about we talk about these kind of as a group. So what you select under Program Can Run will really drive what's available to you in run mode. So, for example, you have three options here. Only when a user is logged on. So if you have only when a user is logged on selected, then you have a choice. You can either run the given deployment with user rights or with admin rights. Okay, there are some scenarios where having the choice to do this is interesting, right? So again, most of the deployments you do probably will be unattended. You'll want to not require the user to have input at all. Maybe in some cases you want the user to have input, but you know that their credentials are not sufficient to be able to do the install. So what you might do is select Run with Admin Rights and then allow that user to interact with the desktop of the administrative session later on. There's an option that will absolutely let you do that. I'll call that out whenever we get there, right? But so in this scenario, one could create a situation where you deploy content under the administrative credentials, but let the user have input and visualize as it goes along. Okay, so typically, if you're going to install when a user is logged on, it will be scenarios where you want to run with user rights. There are two other conditions here: whether or not a user is logged on, and only when no user is logged on. Both of which require administrative credentials be used because there is no user account, or we can't depend on the fact there's a user account. Okay. Now, notice this other switch. And this is the one that I was telling you about. When you have a user that's logged on, when a deployment's running in this context or this context, you have this ability to allow a user to interact with the session. So allow users to view and interact with the program installation. So even if you have administrative rights, right? So if you have user rights, doesn't make any sense to have that option because you're already in the user's context. If you have administrative rights, you can do that. Okay, so a lot of flexibility again as to how you do things. So I'll just leave this with administrative rights and whether or not a user is logged on and move on. Next is and I'll go ahead and set this, which by the way, that's not a common option to put in production environments, but it's a very, very useful option if you're troubleshooting or you want to vet out a distribution process in test before you throw it out into the live production environment. Very, very useful to do. There are some scenarios, less today than there were, but there have been scenarios, for example, where you'll deploy an application, a package, sorry, and it will absolutely go down to the user's environment, to the device that you target, and start to run, but it will sit there and hang. It will just do nothing. And oftentimes the reason for that is because that application is expecting user input, and that was something that was not anticipated, so it just sits there waiting for the user input until it finally times out. Again, more on that in a minute. And then it just goes away and the application never installed. So being able to interact with that session, see what's actually happening during the hang, is very useful, and that option's there. Drive mode is the ability to configure specific drive letters or tie it to a drive letter or specify whether a deployment is able to run with the UNC path. This really doesn't have much play today, and it's really for legacy kind of scenarios, but the option's still there in case you need it. One question that might come up at this point is to say, wait a minute, what do you mean? Run with a drive letter or run with a UNC share? Doesn't all of the content that Configuration Manager provides ultimately get cached on the client system and run from there? Well, the answer is, for the vast majority of things, yes, and that is the intended purpose. That's there for efficiency and so on. That's not always the case. It is. Let me say it here. In package deployment is the only place where you have an option to not do that. Even in package deployment, it is done that way, where content's downloaded to the cache and run locally the vast majority of the time. But it doesn't have to be done that way. You'll see that option as we go along. This last option, to reconnect to the distribution point shares at logon, is something that's not exposed here right now. I don't know what switches would actually cause that to get exposed. I haven't ever seen it show up. But again, it's one of those things that's really not used significantly at all. Really, it's not really necessary in today's world. So that's one you very likely will leave unchecked. Okay, and the reason why, again, why? Because we're not connecting to the distribution point, right? We're not persisting a connection to the distribution point. We're downloading our content typically into the cache on the client and going from there. And by the way, while I keep saying cache, let me just go ahead and show you what I mean. On every Configuration Manager client, oops, did I type that wrong? Yes, I did. On every Configuration Manager client, there is a cache folder. So what we'll do is download content proactively in some scenarios, or on demand in other scenarios, and store it in the cache folder, so that whenever it comes runtime, we'll have it there and won't have to hit the network to get it and run it locally. So that's what I'm talking about when I say cache folder. Okay. All right. Click next. So requirements. So I'll do this in a minute. Let me start down here with platform requirements. So again, with the idea toward flexibility, we give you a lot of options as to how you actually deliver content into your environment. Typically, folks, well, whenever you do a deployment, a package deployment, any kind of deployment really, you need to, the way you get that deployment associated with users or systems, in this case systems, is to build a collection and target the deployment to that collection so that we know the scope in which we need to operate for delivering this content. When you build a collection, typically the criteria of the collection will hone in on just those systems that need to actually receive the deployment. It could be that in a given collection you will have more than the types of systems than you actually want. So maybe you're targeting geographically. Maybe you say the systems in the Houston office need to receive this given package. Well, you could have Windows XP systems, Windows Server systems, Windows 7 systems, all of that in the Houston office. So if you have a collection that describes all the systems in the Houston office, you could target that collection and then use this section to specify which operating systems actually should receive the content. So it allows you that flexibility to do a broader target but be more specific in the rules of the deployment. Downside is, or the thing to understand, I wouldn't necessarily say downside, is that all of the systems in that collection will still need to retrieve that content, especially if it's a mandatory or a required deployment. Okay, so what I see mostly is that when you build the collections, they will be built with the audience, with the scope of just the items that actually need to receive the content, and then here we don't really have platform requirements set at all. Or if anything, since we have the collection scope down already, we use platform options kind of as a fail-safe in addition to that. Okay, so but this is what it is. Estimated disk space. So if you know how much disk space is required for a given application, you can key it in here, and that way whenever we go do the deployment, if we don't have enough disk space, we just don't even try. And we'll report that back to you, status message. We'll come back and say that and so on. This maximum allowed runtime option is pretty important. Okay, by default, everything is 2 hours here. So, and that's fine, right? If you don't have maintenance windows defined in your environment. So maintenance windows are those pieces that allow you to define specifically when deployments are allowed to happen to systems in your environment. So if you have maintenance windows specified, you might have a maintenance window that's an hour and a half, 2 hours, right? Well, if you deploy an application to a maintenance window, the first thing we're going to do is calculate how much time is required for the application, or the package in this case, to execute, and see if we have enough time left in the maintenance window to allow for that, and to allow for potential reboots if that's needed. If you leave this to 2 hours, and you have an hour and a half maintenance window, this will never run, because we never have enough time to actually get through this. And really, 120 minutes is too long for the vast majority of applications. They install faster than that. So setting this to a realistic value is important, especially if you're using maintenance windows. Probably a good practice anyway, because even if you don't use maintenance windows today, you may decide to use them tomorrow and would avoid having to go adjust all of your content that might be configured already. Okay, so that's what that's for. Now, let's go back to the top. Run another program first. This is a mechanism in Configuration Manager that allows you to tie programs together. Okay, so if you're going to deploy, Office, and Office requires just to pick a file, .NET Framework, okay, 3.5 or 4 or whatever, just as an example, right? What you can do is configure here to say, okay, this program is about to deploy, but before it deploys, we need to make sure .NET Framework 4 is there. Okay, so you can actually create a package and program to deploy .NET Framework 4 and tie the two together in this window so that when we check, if it's not there, we have the ability to automatically deploy it, right? So we can say always run the program first, so we're going to check for it, and whether or not it's there, we're going to always run this dependent package, or we're going to check for it and by default leave this unchecked, and if it's already there, we just move on. All right. Now, this offers some flexibility and works fine, right, to do some pretty interesting work around dependencies in applications, in packages, sorry. This really isn't the mechanism that I recommend anymore, because it doesn't give you as nice of a view into knowing all the layers in one place. To me, it works. It's useful if this is all we had, But since we have some other mechanisms today to actually do this better, to me this is there. It's good for legacy support and things like that, but it's not what I would prefer. The thing also here, think about when I say it's not as visible. Think of it this way. So say that you have a package called package E, and it needs package D. Well, you can build some very complex dependency chains. Say that package E actually needs 4 other apps, requires 4 other apps. So you can build a dependency where package E requires package D, and then build a dependency that package D requires package C, and package C requires B, and package B requires A. So you can build a very layered dependency approach. So when you initiate package E, it's going to check all the way down the chain, and the first thing it's going to ultimately check is package A there? If it's there, cool, go to package B. If it's not there, install it, and then go to B, and then go to C, D, ultimately to E. And that does work, but it's hard to trace that through and see that in one place. All right. So, and like I say, there's other mechanisms that do a more elegant job of that today. So applications, which we'll talk about in the next section, has a rules section and a dependency section, so it's very easy to define and see exactly what your dependencies are, decide whether to install them or not, and so on. Plus, there's also the ability in task sequencing to very specifically define the order in which things go on, handle reboots and things like that in the middle. So between the new application model and the task sequence model, really we have the dependency chain stuff covered, and so on. So, but I wanted to go through that so you at least knew what it was. Okay, so we'll clear that and move on. Okay, so now we get to our screen to finish this up, and we will go through and we're done. So we have our sample package 1. Notice that we have one program created as a result, and we don't have any deployments yet. Okay, so let's go through and look at the properties of this and see some options here that we didn't actually see in the window or in the wizard. Okay, remember, wizards are there for simplicity to help you along. It doesn't cover every single thing that might be there. Okay. So here we just go to our general tab. We have information to go back and add comments, that kind of thing. No problem. Data source. So this is where we have, again, we can go back and modify the source location, source files, whatever. Here's our first option that we didn't see in the wizard. Update distribution points on a schedule. So this is to allow you to automate updates to a distribution point if necessary. So remember, the content that arrives at the distribution point is always going to have as its location the source files. I say always, the majority of the cases, the source files. Okay. Let me pause here. There was an option that you saw earlier when we were talking about the import from definition section of this. There was an option I said I would comment on that allowed you to define always obtain content from the source directory or use a compressed file. Using a compressed file was very helpful in the days whenever hard drive space was not all that large, and we needed to save things. Compressed file today is really not used anymore. What that would do is, instead of storing files on a source directory, it would compress it into a single file that you could keep referencing back to if you needed to add distribution points, restage in the distribution point, that kind of thing. So again, not used heavily. Really, I don't think I've seen it used in a long time. The other option, always obtain files from the source directory, is what you would expect to see, where you have that source directory I showed you, and if you're going to update the content, you just simply update the source directory and select to update the distribution point, and we move the content from the source directory out to the various distribution points in the environment. Now, it could be that as you're moving the content from the source directory to the distribution points that it gets compressed. That will be the case if you're moving it site to site. But if you're moving it within a site, it's not. It's just a file transfer. So you will still see some compression happen moving it site to site, like from a primary to a secondary, as an example. But the option to always get from a source directory, that's not a competing thing. It would assume that there's no source directory at all. Hopefully that makes sense. It didn't confuse it. Bottom line is, obtaining it from a compressed source file just really isn't used much today. Okay, so where we got off on that tangent is update distribution points on a schedule. this is a scenario like virus definitions where you're going to go out and maybe the source will need to routinely be updated to include new definitions or whatever. So if you're going to plan for that, then you can use this option to automate the process of updating your distribution points. Frankly, that option is, well, it works and it works fine. It really is probably just as easy to go through and select to update your distribution points whenever it's time to do that, rather than try to rely on some sort of automated mechanism like this. Okay, and that's my preference, is to just go ahead and manually control the update versus rely on the automation, but it's here in case you want to use it. Persist content in client cache. So I showed you the cache folder. The cache folder is where clients will typically or will download their the content that they're needing to run for future execution. It's called download and execute. Okay, so the way the cache file works is, by default, we reserve 5 GB of hard drive space. As you deploy content through your environment, as devices learn that they need to run that content, they will proactively download to the client cache. I say proactively, let me define for a minute. If a deployment is slated as required, and then we know it's going to run at some point in the future, and so we will proactively download that content to the cache, so when it comes runtime, it's there. We can just execute it locally. If content is slated as available, again, you'll see those in a minute, then we're not going to proactively cache the information in the cache folder. We're not going to proactively download the content to the cache folder because we don't know if it's ever going to be executed on the device, right? So in those scenarios, if you decide to run it, then at that time we'll go through the download of the content into the cache, same way, and then once it's in the cache, we'll be able to execute it. All right, so that's what I keep meaning by proactively download. So the cache is 5 GB in size by default. You have the ability to modify that on the command line when you install the client later in the Config Manager Control Panel applet, which you'll see in a future session, or by script, right? But by default, it's 5 gig. So the cache works kind of as a first in, first out scenario. So whenever you target content to a given device, it will download the content into the cache and mark it for future execution. Once the execution happens, then we'll mark it as eligible for deletion. The content doesn't get deleted from the cache until there's a space crunch and the client needs more room in the cache. Whenever there's content coming in that would exceed the allowable space in the cache today, then we'll go figure out, are there things we can delete and clean those up and move the new content in that needs to be deployed. If we ever need the content that was removed again, then we have to go get it again. And so you can get in this cycle of getting content, deleting content, getting it again, deleting it again, that kind of thing. So if it's something that you expect to be run on a recurring schedule, then it's a good idea to enable or to flag it as being persisted in the cache. That way, once it's there, it stays there and is not deleted. Now, obviously, that's an option you don't want to use on every single piece of content out there because it would fill up your cache and you would never be able to delete anything. Okay. Another question that sometimes happens with this is, okay, your default cache size is 5 gig. If I have a 10 gig package that I need to deploy, does the cache dynamically resize? No, it doesn't. You would actually see that fail. Okay, that would be surfaced up through status messages and so on if you don't have enough space in your cache, and then you'll need to take corrective action. 5 gig is a decent number. Everyone has their own experience in their own environment, so again, very very flexible to change that to specific needs. Some folks even reduce it. Okay. Enable binary delta replication. So Config Manager is always trying to be sensitive. It is very optimized to be sensitive to bandwidth contention, to not swamping bandwidth. So by default, we're already going to only, if we have a scenario where we've deployed content in the environment, so maybe we have source version A of our files, we've deployed those to distribution points, and then you make a tweak and update a couple of files in your source directory and redeploy the content to your distribution points, we're already going to only send out the changes to your distribution point that have actually happened. So if you have 100 files in your source directory, for example, and only 2 of them change, there's no reason to send the other 98. We're only going to send the 2 by default. Binary delta replication goes further than that. So now not only do we just send the 2 that changed, we only send the changes within those files that happened. So said another way, if you have a 100 kilobyte file, and that new version of the file is 101 kilobyte, right? Then we're going to be able to figure out what's new. What are the binary differences from one version of the file to the next, and package up those changes and send those across the network. So it's even more efficient, right? If you have a 100 kilobyte file, 100 kilobytes in size, it's not a big deal, right? That's small. But think about whenever you have a 2 megabyte file, right? Same kind of deal applies. If it's only a 100 KB of information that changed in that file, that's what we package and send down. So that's where you see the efficiency gains. Now, full disclosure about that, there will be a time at which we will have to send down the entire content again. We don't just keep sending deltas forever and ever. At some point, we want to clear the slate, send down a complete new version of the content, and then keep tracking deltas from there. I haven't tested that in a while. As I recall, it's five versions, but don't hold me to that. I'd have to retest it in 2012 to make sure. But that's what it does. At some point, we'll send down the full package again. All right, so next tab, so data access. So this is where you can configure an actual share. So whenever you deploy content to distribution points, normally it's going to go out to our standard distribution point location. So again, let's take a look at that. So our standard distribution point location is this. So whenever you deploy your content, it's going to arrive in the SCCM content library folder, and that's where it will be distributed from. You also see the SMS PKG C dollar share. That's our legacy distribution point structure. Talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Suffice it to say right here, that is still used in corner scenarios, but the standard distribution share for everything else is SCCM content library. Now, the server share that we're talking about in the UI there is the ability to not use our standard distribution point locations, but instead specify a specific share that you want to make use of as the distribution point. Historically, that's allowed you to bypass some of the distribution point selection logic that takes place in previous versions of a configuration manager and specify exactly where your distribution point would reside. There are options in 2012 that allow you to do some of that kind of work outside of using a share. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at those. So if we go to our distribution point here in administration and go on to a server that doesn't have one right now, I'll just pretend like I'm going to go ahead and install one. I'm going to right click and select to add a new distribution point. And one of the first screens that you're going to get, so I'm going to click next to here, one of the first screens you're going to get is to decide for the distribution point where your or how your disks should be treated. Again, move on past this window, and here is the page that we can configure that information on. So under drive settings, you can specifically decide how much space to allocate to your distribution point, where the primary content library should be located, so that SCCM content lib folder, the secondary location for the content library. So here, you either can allow it to automatically select where it will use its internal algorithm to figure things out, or you can specify, either way. Then for the primary package share, which is the legacy of the classic SMS PKG drive letter dollar folder, where it's going to be located, whether it's going to be handled automatically or specified, and so on. So that should get around the need to use a server share, though it's still possible if you want to do that in the system. Okay, so that's what that's all about. So let's go back here to the properties of the package and continue. So the next piece, package update settings. So this again is one of those pieces that's still there, really rarely used, but really came about for situations where servers maybe had sessions that were being persisted to them by the clients for whatever reason, or connections persisted. You know, that whole idea that we talked about earlier about running content from the distribution point. I don't know if I phrase it exactly that way, but there's another option that's available beyond the download and execute, the storing things in the cache. And sometimes you would have clients that would persist connections to the distribution point. This just allows you to go ahead and clear them out if you wanted to. Again, it's not something that you typically are going to use, but it's there. Distribution settings, you can specify a priority for distributing content. So pretty much every content piece in 2012 goes site to site by medium priority. So there are two different content distribution mechanisms, or site-to-site replication mechanisms in Configuration Manager 2012. The first is the legacy file-based copy mechanism that we still use to move things like content around, packages, software updates, OSD images, those kinds of things still get moved around by the file mechanism. So that kind of mechanism, for example, will come into play if you're trying to move content from a primary site to a secondary site's distribution point, that kind of thing. Other than that, if you have content that's at a primary site that you're just replicating to a distribution point, that's just done by file copy locally. Nothing through the system necessary for site to site. The other, just to delineate, site to site replication mechanism we have is SQL replication. And that takes care of things like package definitions, collections, site control files. Some of those terms you may not know what they mean yet, and that's okay. But anyway, you have the choice. If there's something that really needs to get out in a more rapid way, you can set medium, high, or low priority here, and we'll route accordingly. In most cases, you'll find, I think, that this is not really all that advantageous. Things will typically route out the way that they or in a very efficient way anyway. But if you need it, it's here. Okay. Other things that are available here are options to allow you to distribute content using pre-stage media and preferred pre-stage media is down here. Preferred distribution points. So if you have preferred distribution points defined, and you likely will, then you can go ahead and select this checkbox and allow the content to be deployed that way. Now, a little bit more about what this means, because this really is a pretty cool feature. So, like the text says, there are scenarios where you may not want to deploy your content to every single distribution point right away, but yet your clients may actually receive instructions to run content, or take another way. Maybe you have a piece of content that you don't want to make required, you don't want to set it to be required throughout the environment, but you want to make it available to those systems that would like to run it, those users that would like to run it. So you may not stage it at all your distribution points right now, but instead you may go ahead and deploy the content, make it available to your population, and if that content's requested, then there's a mechanism that will allow that content to be triggered to be deployed to a preferred distribution point for that given machine, for that given machine's boundary, that kind of thing, right? So kind of a distribute on demand is what this was called in Config Manager 2012. And in Config Manager 2012, it just applied to branch distribution points if you're coming from that product. In 2012, it applies generically to all distribution points. Okay. Well, and one thing about distribution points while we're here, and I'll probably mention this several times as we go through these sessions, distribution points in Config Manager 2012 are all the same. There is no delineation. There is no such thing meaning for branch distribution points anymore. Yes, you can have distribution points on Windows 7 workstation class machines, but they're standard distribution points just like you would have on a server. Okay. Pre-stage distribution point settings are configurable here. Operating system deployment settings, if you want to allow multicast for information in Windows PE phase of operating system deployment, you can allow that here. Reporting. So this enables a legacy kind of reporting using custom MIFs known as no ID MIFs, ID MIFs, those kinds of things. Typically, you don't need that today. It's for, again, backwards compatibility purposes. You can still use it if you need it, but very, very rare, I would think, that you would use that today. Content locations. So where the content is, what distribution points the content's been deployed to. In this case, none so far. And then our security setting. So we have a security tab pretty much everywhere that tells who has rights to this particular node. And a little bit on security here. This discussion definitely on security will take its own session to go through, but it's worth mentioning here. So on our software library, pretty much many of our nodes here in our software library, go to our package here. Notice that we have an option to set our security scope. So for package objects, for application objects, for updates, again, many objects through the system, you can configure which security scope should contain an object. So you can also assign users to those given security scopes. So basically, you can customize their view of the console to only those objects they need to see. Historically, there's been many environments where you might have configuration manager managing workstations, managing servers, and you would want two different teams doing that. So to keep the two teams from affecting each other's settings, you might have deployed one primary, one for servers, one for workstation class machines. There's really no technical reason to do that anymore because you can very much control which population interacts with which pieces just by setting security scopes. Again, not a security discussion that we're having here, but when we do touch on that security tab in the console, it brings it to mind, and at least it's worth discussing. All right, so that's properties of the package. So now we have the program itself. So if we go to the program and look at properties, again, we have some things to explore. So we have the General tab, and again, here's where we have our command line. We saw this part in the wizard. Okay, we have our start in, run normally, after running. I'm sorry, we didn't even, I don't think, yeah, we saw the run setting in the wizard. We did not see an after running switch. So this is a new piece that we have in the properties that we don't have in the wizard. So after running basically allows you to determine what kind of action you want to take. Typically, no action required is fine. But if you wanted to, then you could flag config manager to restart the computer, config manager to log the user off, or if you know that the program is going to cause the computer to restart, then you can note it here. Now, if you don't note it, it still works, but just the right thing to do. If you have knowledge that the program is going to restart the computer, that you flag configuration manager accordingly so that it matches the anticipated action. Okay. Requirements. So we talked about this already. This is where we specify the runtime, the disk space, the supported platforms, whatever. Oh, by the way, on the General tab, we do have a category. I don't have any set up. But you can specify categories if you would like for your programs so that you might have OS tools or productivity apps or whatever you choose to create for your own categories, and you can build those accordingly. One thing that's interesting here, so I'll just go ahead and say it, that may not be readily apparent. We'll talk about on the client side this software catalog that's available. We'll talk about it probably some in the next session where we talk about application deployment. We will talk about it, sorry, next session where we talk about application deployment. So the software catalog is a place that users can go if a given deployment is targeted to a user collection, and that's key. In order for something to show up in the user in the catalog, the application catalog, it has to be targeted to a user collection, user group collection. If it's targeted to a user group or user collection, it will show up there and have associated detail information of hopefully descriptive to the user to be able to figure out what it is, whether they want to run it, that kind of thing. Whenever I was putting this together, I didn't realize that even the legacy programs, packages, and so on will show up in the software catalog. Typically, that's or whenever I was when you look at it, it's pretty obvious on applications that there's a software catalog component. But if you actually deploy your package and program to a user group or user-based collection, it will show up in the catalog there as well. Okay, so with that, if you specify a category, it will group it pretty nicely in the software catalog, and the user can browse through a little bit better. Okay. Environment. So this again is allowing you to set whether you're going to run with admin rights, whether you're going to allow interaction, whether or not a user is logged on, those options, that kind of thing. Okay, the same drive settings we talked about already. Some of our advanced tabs. This is where you set up your dependencies. Okay, any notification suppressions. Here is where you can actually disable the program. So this is kind of cool because it allows you a couple of things. Say that you're proactively preparing content for future deployment. You can go ahead and prepare it, put it in the system, and disable it for now so that it doesn't go anywhere. Or if we are at the end of life for a given deployment, you can go ahead and disable it and not necessarily delete it right away and have that decision, maybe down the line, whether to delete it, whether to export it, save it off, that kind of thing. Next option, allow the program to be installed from the install package task for a task sequence. Okay? That's pretty interesting. So in some cases, well, in the case of applications, in the case of package deployment, the mechanism for getting that content delivered to our target audience, devices or users, is to create a collection and target that collection with the deployment. Okay? So that's going to be normal operation for applications and packages. Well, what about imaging? In imaging scenarios, you might want to deploy given software or given content to an imaging system. But maybe that system's not in the collections yet or to receive that content. So normally you wouldn't be able to run it at all. It wouldn't even be visible, right? Because we expect that association. So this flag allows you to be able to run that deployment just via task sequencing, even without a direct advertisement through imaging. Also has implications in task sequences just for software deployment in general without having to target a collection. So for example, say that you spin up 4 or 5 packages that you're going to deliver by a task sequence, and there's really no other place that you're going to deliver those things. You're just going to build a task sequence not for OSD but for the sole purpose of deploying content. So that task sequence then would be associated with a collection just like a normal deployment would be, but your deployments are sitting out here and they're not associated. So if you enable this flag, you're going to be able to deploy this content through that task sequence just as you want to do. But without this flag, it's going to fail. So the Windows Installer tab is pretty interesting. So historically, there've been a few challenges with Windows Installer, especially as the technology first came out. Today, it's pretty old hat, pretty commonplace. But there were issues, for example, where the MSI file was installed, but then later either the source MSI was moved, the registry key was changed, something happened, and the registry information that's stored on the client when the MSI installs that basically tells the application how to get back to its source files, somehow that registry key either was adjusted or the source location was moved or something happened to break that association. So you would have applications that were getting updated, upgraded, whatever the case may be, and one of the first things the MSI application will do is go try to find its source files. And if it couldn't find the source files, you would have problems. That same kind of thing would happen with MSI if it was going to repair itself or add a new feature or that kind of thing. If you can't find its source files, there's a problem. So we put into Configuration Manager this ability to import the information about an MSI, and as long as that package or content is available in the system and on a distribution point, we basically repoint the client's registry, device's registry, to our distribution point shares as a source for the MSI. That way we always can get to it. So pretty easy to do. If you just import and point at an MSI, then we'll go grab the information about the MSI here. I'll just pick one and import it into the system. Now we know about it, so whenever the client needs it, receives this deployment, stores it in the registry. Whenever the client needs it, it's on our distribution points and it's good to go. All right. Ops Manager maintenance mode. So this is a really cool feature for folks who have Ops Manager. Unfortunately, it didn't work in Configuration Manager 2007. Not really a Configuration Manager 2007 issue so much as it was some Ops Manager tweaks that needed to happen. There was a Config Manager 2007 piece. For example, the component that actually worked on the Ops Manager agent to place it into maintenance mode, and I put that term in quotes, only really worked on a 32-bit system. It didn't work on a 64-bit system. Now it does work on Operations Manager agents, no problem. Or said another way, Operations Manager maintenance mode is workable from a Configuration Manager 2012 client. So how this works is, as we're running a deployment, software updates, a standard deployment like this, whatever the case may be, there may be some indicators of problems like a reboot or whatever that happen as a result of our deployment. So in order to keep Ops Manager happy and not throwing alerts that really aren't meaningful because we are truly in maintenance at the time, you can set maintenance mode. For Ops Manager folks, what that would normally appear to be in the Ops Manager console is a little icon that shows a wrench that says, hey, this system's in maintenance mode. Well, that's not what happens on Configuration Manager clients. In fact, there's really no indication in the Ops Manager console that a Config Manager client is in maintenance mode, or that the Ops Manager agent on a Config Manager client is in maintenance mode. What happens instead is that when you set these flags, whenever we initiate a deployment, we'll actually pause the health service on the agent. And during that time, basically there's nothing that gets reported back to the management server. So if there's a problem, we're in maintenance, no big deal. Very similar to real Ops Manager maintenance mode. Then, whenever we get done with our deployment, we will unpause or resume the agent, Ops Manager agent, and it picks up from that point forward. So anything that happened during the deployment time is not picked up, is not refed into the system. It truly is in maintenance, though it's not truly real Ops Manager maintenance mode all the way through. It's effective, okay? And this works fine in Configuration Manager 2012. All right, so that said, let's go create a deployment. So the way I do that, I'm just going to go ahead and right-click on my program and select to deploy. Now, I could do that from the ribbon as well, just to call your attention there. So I'm going to click deploy. And here, I know what I'm going to deploy. I've already got the package. I've selected the program I'm going to deploy, so I don't have to put that in again. Now I have to choose a collection. So I'm just going to choose all systems just because it's here, not because I recommend it in production. And here I get to choose use our default distribution points associated with a collection. Remember back to your distribution point groups, you can define in a distribution point group when I'm targeting a given collection what the associated distribution points are. So if you have that set up, that's what this check mark means. There's also a check mark here if there are dependencies, which we don't have any defined here, but if there are, to automatically distribute content for those dependencies, so that's grayed out. On the next screen, we have the ability to see the distribution points that are out there to specify. To specify the distribution points we want the content on. So I don't have any right now, but I'll go ahead and specify one of my distribution point groups. Only have one, so good to go. Okay, click next. And then set whether the application is required or available. Okay, so if you set this to be available, that's basically saying it's optional. The user doesn't have to, or the system doesn't have to install this thing. And so consequently, on the next screen, you'll see there is no required schedule for this. It's grayed out. But if you set it to be required, that means there is no choice. At some point in the future, it's going to receive this content. And then you can decide whether or not you need to do a Wake-on-Lan kind of scenario to wake the system up. If we have power management in play, then you might already have some wake-up timers configured. That's not going to play in this arena. This is for Wake-on-Lan. There's also some AMT functionality you can do, but again, this is for Wake-on-Lan. Then we have this ability to display or deploy automatically according to schedule whether or not a user is logged on. So that's grayed out because of some other configurations we've made. So, but that's an option if the configurations along the line allow it to be. So here, I have it set to require. So now this is mandatory, and it's going to be an install, not an uninstall. And so when I go to the next tab, I am required to input a schedule. When will this actually run? So I have a couple of choices. Either I can assign to a very defined schedule with a recurrence pattern if I want to, or I can go ahead and do what a lot of folks do and assign as soon as possible. Okay. Hopefully, we're in a proactive situation where we have time ahead of the deployment, and we can assign to a schedule in the future. Let the content get out to the client systems, proactively download by bits, that kind of thing. But if you have to, as soon as possible is an option. You also have options for at log on or at log off. Okay. So I'm going to leave this as not mandatory. I'm going to go back and change that in a minute. Other options, so if we're deploying content that's already run in the past, we can slate never rerun the deployed program. Now, when I say run in the past, I'm not saying that it's been installed by another mechanism. I'm simply saying if Configuration Manager has ever deployed this application or this package before, then we're going to know that, and we're not going to redeploy it with this setting. Or we can choose to always rerun, which is what you would want in the case of a recurrent deployment. Rerun if failed previously to take corrective actions and get it deployed if there was a problem. Rerun if succeeded on previous attempt. Okay, so a lot of flexibility there if you want to just make the setting appropriately. Then we have up here, again, in that proactive scenario, if you've been able to build this stuff out, make it available to the device population, the client population ahead of time, then you can select when does it actually go live. Maybe in the interim, you can use it for testing. Maybe another deployment was set up for testing purposes on a limited subset. This is the one that's going out to the broader subset of production, so you can determine when it's going to go live, and until then, it's not going to be visible by the users, by the clients. And then also, on the opposite side, when the deployment will expire. When do you expect it all to be done, and when do you want it to expire? Okay. So like I said, I'm going to go back and make this just available. Click Next. Now, notification settings. So allow users to run the program independent of assignments. We've already seen that. We've already talked about that. That option would be available if this were set to required. But it's not. It's set as available, so that option doesn't make any sense. The only way a user is going to run it is by selecting it to execute. Okay, then we have the maintenance window settings. So if you have maintenance windows defined, then nothing is going to run by default until you get into that maintenance window. So these installations would basically get to the device, be noticed by the device. Yeah, we maybe start to download content because we know at some point we're going to run this thing maybe, but we're not going to do anything until the maintenance window shows up. Well, if there's something that you need to deploy out to the environment and run regardless of maintenance windows, it's that important, then we give you on a per deployment basis the ability to override those settings and do the same thing for reboots. Okay, so now you have distribution points. So this is what I alluded to earlier, where the vast majority of the deployments that you will do will be that download and execute. So download the content from the distribution point and run locally. That's standard behavior. But if you want to run something from the distribution point, you can do that. And that was available in the previous versions of Configuration Manager, which is why it's still here for backwards compatibility. This is the only place, by the way, where we make use of our legacy style distribution point. So if you want content to show up on this distribution point, you need to make the setting for the program or for the deployment accordingly. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and put it on that legacy style distribution point. Okay, but again, the vast majority is run from the first option, which is download the content and run it locally from the cache. Okay. Then the last option here is to either choose to choose to do not run the program if you're in what's known as a slow boundary. So when you go into the boundaries section, let me go back there for a second, you have the ability to configure a boundary as being fast or slow. Actually, let me go into the boundary group and you'll see it there. So if I go to properties, Oops, sorry, I think I was in the right place to start with. Oh, sorry, my bad. I was actually in the right place from the first one. So if I go to Properties of the Boundary Group and hit the References tab, then you're going to see that I have the ability to specify a boundary as fast or slow, but I'm not doing it on the boundary itself. I'm doing it on the distribution point because that's where we care if something's fast or slow. Meaning, if we're within the boundaries of a distribution point, but we have that distribution point flagged as slow when it's servicing the boundaries that are defined, okay, then we can decide what do we do. Do not run the program by default and wait, or do we download the content and run it locally anyway, right? Do we allow clients to share the content? So maybe once the first client downloads it, we allow those clients to share. This is really independent of the slow setting. Really what this does is turns on and leverages Branchcache, right? So Windows 7 clients can participate, Windows Vista as well, can participate in Branchcache. This is really cool. By default, it's turned on. So if a single client on a subnet gets the content, then now it can begin serving up the content locally to peer clients, which is really nice, okay? Then the last option, allow clients to use a fallback source location for content. So this is the scenario we've talked about already where we have distribution points. Those distribution points are either protected or they're not, right? The default is to protect, but you can actually set up a distribution point on a case-by-case basis to be addressable as a fallback distribution point. So if the client needs content but it's not in any boundary that matches a boundary group, then these distribution points might show up as being available to the client if you turn this option on. Okay. Now back to this one for a minute about fast or slow or whatever else. One thing about boundaries, and I'm done here. I'm just going to click next and finish. One thing about boundaries that we've all learned over the years is that you cannot have overlapping boundaries. It's not supported to have overlapping boundaries, and that's still true in terms of client assignment. So you do not want your boundaries to overlap when you're trying to assign clients. Okay? But it's perfectly okay to have boundaries that overlap whenever you're trying to find content. So the reason I bring that up, it's very possible that you would have maybe the distribution point here on my secondary site that is in a boundary group for certain boundaries, and when clients are on those boundaries, the connection from those boundaries to our secondary site distribution point would be considered slow. So we would flag those accordingly. But you could also have that secondary site distribution point as part of a boundary group with completely different set of boundaries and have those set as fast. That's fine, right? It's up to you. You could, and that would be, I don't know if that's technically an overlapping boundary scenario or an overlapping distribution point. I'm not sure, but you get the idea. Same thing goes the other way. You could have a given boundary that's part of more than one boundary group servicing or providing access to multiple distribution points. So all doable. All right. So that covers what I really wanted to talk about in this session in terms of distribution points and so on. So the next sessions, again, next one we'll talk about applications, and we'll just keep pulling the covers back from here, and we'll see you on the next talk.